Hey everyone, welcome back to Bella Dark Tales. If you're new here, I want you to take a moment right now. Look around wherever you're sitting. Maybe you're in your bedroom. Maybe you're on your couch with the lights dimmed. Maybe you've got headphones in and the world feels far away. Now I want you to think about something. Your neighbors. The people who live just a few feet away from you. The ones separated from you by nothing more than a wall, a fence, or a quiet suburban street. The people you wave to in the morning. The ones whose cars you recognize. The ones you think you know. But do you really? Because the stories I'm sharing with you tonight, all three of them, are about neighbors. Real people. Normal-looking people. People who seem perfectly fine on the outside. And every single one of these stories ends the same way. With the realization that the whole time you thought you were just living your life, someone next door was watching. So turn the lights on if you need to. Or don't. It won't really matter. Because after tonight, you're going to look at your neighbor's windows a little differently. Let's begin. I want you to picture a girl named Cassie. She's 24 years old, just moved to a new city for a job in marketing. She doesn't know anyone there yet. She's got a small apartment on the 4th floor of a mid-rise building in a fairly quiet neighborhood. Not great, not terrible. The kind of place where young professionals land when they're just starting out and can't afford anything nicer yet. The building has 6 floors, maybe 30 units total. A small lobby with a buzzer system. An elevator that works most of the time. A laundry room in the basement that always smells faintly of mildew no matter how many times the management sprays it. Cassie moves in on a Saturday in early October. She's carrying boxes up from a rented van, sweating through her hoodie, hair in a messy ponytail, completely focused on getting her stuff upstairs. She makes maybe 6 or 7 trips. On her 4th trip up in the elevator, she notices a man standing in the hallway just outside his apartment. He's in his mid-50s. Medium height. A little heavy-set, with gray hair that's thinning on top. He's wearing khaki pants and a plain blue button-down shirt, like he's dressed for a casual office job even though it's Saturday afternoon. He's just standing there, not doing anything. No phone in his hand. No bag. No keys. Just standing. Cassie gives him a polite smile because that's what you do. He smiles back. It's a perfectly normal smile. Moving in? He says. Yeah, she says. 4A. Right next door, he says. I'm Gerald. 4B. She tells him her name. They exchange the usual pleasantries. Where are you from? What do you do? Hope you like it here. He seems nice enough. A little stiff, maybe. The kind of guy who's been living alone for a long time and has gotten slightly awkward around people. But perfectly harmless. He even offers to help her carry boxes. She politely declines. He nods, goes back inside, and she thinks nothing more of it. The first week is completely uneventful. Cassie gets settled in. She arranges her furniture, buys groceries, starts her new job. She sees Gerald a handful of times in the hallway or the elevator. He always says hello. He always asks how she's settling in. She gives short, friendly answers and keeps moving. He never tries to extend the conversation beyond what's normal. Normal neighbor stuff. The first thing that gives her a tiny flicker of unease happens about 10 days after she moves in. She's standing in the elevator, heading down to check her mail. The elevator opens on the lobby level and Gerald is standing there, already dressed, holding a small brown bag from what looks like a deli. Morning, he says. Good morning, she says. He steps in. They ride up together in comfortable enough silence. Then, just before the doors open on 4, he says, "You should probably eat something before you head out today. Big presentation, right?" And he walks off the elevator and down the hall. Cassie stands there for a second. She had a presentation that day. Her first major one at the new job. She had mentioned it to a co-worker. She had texted about it with her mom. But she had not, she was almost certain, mentioned it to Gerald. She goes into her apartment and thinks about it. Maybe she had mentioned it in passing and forgotten. Maybe she had been talking on the phone in the hallway and he overheard. She decides it was probably one of those things and doesn't bring it up. But the feeling sits with her. A few days later, she comes home from work to find a small sticky note on her door. It reads, "Heard you get home late on Thursdays. Left some soup in the hall in case you haven't eaten. Gee." She steps back and looks down the hallway. There's a small container of soup sitting on the floor next to her door. Still warm. Okay. So that's a little strange. She doesn't eat the soup. She puts it in a bag and throws it in the trash chute. And she thinks, okay, he's just a lonely older man who's trying to be neighborly in a slightly too much kind of way. It happens. Some people just don't have great boundaries. She makes a mental note to be a little cooler toward him. Not rude, just less available. And she tells herself she'll stop feeling uneasy about it once she makes some friends in the city and has more of a life to fill her time. That night, she goes to bed around 11. At 11:45, she wakes up. She doesn't know why at first. She just opens her eyes and lies there in the dark, heart already beating a little too fast, the way it does when something wakes you up and your body reacts before your brain does. Then she hears it. A sound. From the wall. Her apartment and Gerald's apartment share a wall, the one along the left side of her bedroom. And the sound coming from the other side of that wall is tapping. Just a quiet, steady tap tap tap. Rhythmic. Not like someone hammering or doing work. More like fingers. Fingers tapping slowly against the wall. Once every few seconds. She lies completely still, listening. Tap. 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 She tells herself it could be a pipe. It could be the building settling. It could be anything. Old buildings make sounds. She puts her pillow over her head and eventually falls back asleep. In the morning, she convinces herself it was nothing. About 2 weeks after that, Cassie starts dating someone. His name is Marco. They meet through a mutual friend at a work happy hour. He's tall, funny, easy to be around. They go on a few dates in quick succession, and by their 4th date he's coming back to her apartment for the first time. She's nervous and excited and happy, the way you are in those early weeks with someone new. They're in her apartment for maybe an hour when her phone buzzes. It's a text from an unknown number. She almost doesn't read it. She's in the middle of a conversation, laughing, feeling good. But something makes her glance down. The text says, "He's not right for you. You'll figure that out soon enough." She stares at it. "You okay?" Marco asks. "Yeah," she says, putting her phone face down. "Wrong number." But her hands are shaking slightly. She goes to the bathroom and types a reply to the unknown number. "Who is this?" The response comes back in less than 30 seconds. "A friend who pays attention." She blocks the number. She doesn't tell Marco about it. She doesn't tell anyone about it. She starts sleeping with her lights on that night. 3 days later she runs into Gerald in the elevator. This time she pays close attention to him. Really looks at him. He's his usual self, friendly, slightly stiff, perfectly ordinary on the surface. He asks how she's doing. She says fine. He asks if she's been sleeping okay because he thought he heard her up late a few nights ago. And right there, That's the moment she starts to really feel it. Not just unease. Fear. Because her bedroom is on the interior wall. Her living room faces the hallway. For him to hear her up late, he would have to be listening through the shared wall. The bedroom wall. She says she's been sleeping fine and walks quickly to her apartment. Inside, with the door locked and the chain on, she opens her laptop and sits down and thinks. She thinks about everything. The presentation comment. The soup. The tapping. The unknown text. The comment about hearing her up late. And then she thinks, how did he know Marco came over? She had not mentioned Marco to anyone in the building. Marco had come in through the main entrance. He buzzed up on the intercom, and she'd let him in. Gerald's apartment is on the same floor, yes. But Gerald would have had to be watching through his peephole to see Marco come down the hall and go into her apartment. That's possible. Creepy, but possible. But the text had come within the first hour Marco was there. Before they'd even gone out again. Nobody else in the building knew Marco. So how had someone in the building, how had Gerald, gotten her phone number? She thinks about when she moved in. The paperwork she filled out for the building management office. Her phone number would have been on that. And Gerald, in a mid-sized building like this, maybe Gerald had access to that somehow. Maybe he was friendly with the super. Maybe he'd just seen it on a package delivered to the wrong door. It was possible. It was all possible. It was also terrifying. She calls Marco that night and tells him what's going on. He gets angry, not at her, at the situation. He wants to come over. She asks him not to, not yet. She needs to figure out what to do first. The next morning she goes to the building manager's office on the first floor. She sits down with a woman named Ellen who manages the property. She explains the situation, the comments that seem like he knows too much about her life. The tapping at night, the soup left on her door, the text she believes came from him. She shows Ellen the texts. Ellen listens carefully. She looks genuinely concerned, which is something. She tells Cassie that she can't give out other tenants' information, and she stresses that Gerald has lived in the building for 11 years and has never been the subject of a complaint before. 11 years. Cassie hadn't known that. She just assumed from his manner that he'd been there a few years maybe. But 11 years, that's a long time. Long enough to know everyone who moved in and out of 4A. Long enough to have a pattern. Has anyone else in 4A ever had problems with him? Cassie asks. Ellen hesitates. That hesitation says everything. A previous tenant did come to me with some concerns, Ellen says carefully. But that was quite a while ago, and she moved out before anything was formally reported. Cassie grips the arms of her chair. I need to know, she says. If there's anything in his unit, cameras, anything in the walls, that would let him see or hear into mine. Ellen assures her that's not possible. That the building does inspections. That there are rules. But the way she says it, the way she's very careful not to quite meet Cassie's eyes, doesn't make Cassie feel better. She goes back to her apartment, and she does what anyone would do in this day and age. She buys a bug detector. She orders it on overnight shipping. It arrives the next evening. She turns off every electronic device in her apartment, dims the lights, and she slowly walks the device along every wall, every outlet, every smoke detector. In her bedroom, along the shared wall with Gerald's apartment, near the baseboard just behind her nightstand. The detector lights up. She drags the nightstand away from the wall. There's a small hole in the baseboard, maybe the size of a pencil eraser. Just barely visible. And inside it, a tiny device. No bigger than a button. With a small metal pinhole that, if you look close enough, looks like a lens. A camera. She steps back from the wall, and her whole body goes cold. She stands in her bedroom with her hand over her mouth for a long moment. Then she grabs her phone and calls the police. 2 officers come. They confirm what she found. They knock on Gerald's door. He answers immediately, like he was already standing right there. In his apartment, they find what amounts to a surveillance operation. Cameras positioned to see through the walls into her apartment had been installed through tiny holes drilled at precise angles, into her bedroom, her living room, the hallway just outside her bathroom. A receiver tucked in a drawer. Recordings going back to the day she moved in. The officers walk him out in handcuffs. He doesn't yell or cry or protest. He just walks. Calmly. Quietly. Like a man who knew this was always going to happen eventually, and had simply accepted it. At the door, he turns. And he looks directly at the camera he knew she'd found. The one that was pointed at her bedroom. And he says, "I hope you know I only ever wanted to protect you." The door closes behind him. When detectives searched the apartment further, they found something that shook everyone, including the experienced officers. There was a binder. A thick 3-ring binder sitting on the bookshelf like it was just another book. Inside were printed photographs, printed copies of text conversations, somehow obtained, schedules, notes written in Gerald's handwriting detailing Cassie's daily routine in meticulous detail. Her exact work schedule. Her gym days. The restaurants she visited. The coffee shop she stopped at every Tuesday morning. And at the back of the binder, a section dedicated to previous tenants of 4A. 4 of them. Going back 8 years. Each section with their own photos. Their own schedules. None of them had ever filed a police report. The detectives tried to reach every previous tenant of that apartment. They reached 3 of them. When they explained who Gerald was and what they had found, all 3 said some version of the same thing. "I always felt like someone was watching me. I just thought I was being paranoid. I moved out and tried to forget about it." The 4th tenant? She had moved away with no forwarding address. Nobody could find her. Cassie moved out of that building within a week. She stayed with Marco while she found a new place. She installed security cameras at every entrance of her new apartment before she even fully unpacked. She had the walls inspected. She slept with the lights on for 3 months. Gerald was charged with multiple counts of invasion of privacy and stalking. There were additional charges pending related to the devices found in the walls and evidence obtained from the recordings. But here's the thing that Cassie can't stop thinking about. The tapping. Those quiet, rhythmic taps on the wall in the middle of the night. When she asked the detective about it, whether they had any explanation for it, the detective looked at her with this careful expression and said, "Based on the placement of one of the cameras and the angle it was positioned, we believe he would tap on the wall to see if you'd react. To see if you'd wake up and move closer to the wall. To get a better angle on the recording." Cassie just stared at him. "So when he was tapping," she said slowly, "he was just on the other side of that wall." "Yes," the detective said. "Watching me." "Yes." She never went back to that building again. Not even to pick up the last few things she'd left. She told Marco later that what she couldn't get over, what she genuinely couldn't process, was not the cameras. Not even the binder. It was that first day. When she was moving in and he was standing in the hallway, and she smiled at him and told him her name. And he already knew it. This story comes from a man named Thomas. He's in his late 30s now, a high school science teacher, married with a young son. He lives in a quiet suburb. The kind of neighborhood where Halloween decorations stay up a week too long and people leave their garage doors open all afternoon without worrying about it. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone's car, everyone's dog, and most people's approximate schedules. Thomas had lived on Birchwood Lane for 6 years. He and his wife, Nora, had bought their house there when their son was still an infant. By the time this story begins, their son, Eli, is 5 years old and in kindergarten. The house next door, 119 Birchwood Lane, right across the narrow driveway that separated the two properties, had been empty for about 8 months. The previous owners had been a retired couple who moved to be closer to family. Nice people. Thomas and Nora had gotten along well with them. Then, in the early spring, a new family moved in. Thomas first saw them on a Sunday morning in March. He was pulling out of his driveway heading to the hardware store when he noticed activity next door, a moving truck, several people carrying boxes. He rolled down his window and waved. A man came over. He introduced himself as Carl. Late 40s, square-jawed, handshake so firm it was almost aggressive. Fit in a way that looked deliberate, like a man who spent a lot of time and discipline on staying that way. Flat effect. Short sentences. Very precise eye contact. Carl's wife came over a moment later. Her name was Ruth. She was slender and quiet and smiled in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was dressed neatly, almost too neatly for moving day, Thomas thought, like she'd put careful effort into looking normal. There were 2 children, Carl said. A boy of about 12 and a girl around 8 or 9. Thomas didn't meet them that day. Carl said they were tired from the long drive. Thomas told them to let him and Nora know if they needed anything, gave a friendly nod, and drove to the hardware store. On the way, he thought pleasant enough people. He thought, good to have the house occupied again. He thought nothing more about it. The second week, Nora starts to form her own impression. She mentions to Thomas one evening that she hasn't seen Ruth or the children outside at all. Not once. Carl comes and goes. She sees his car leave in the mornings and return in the afternoons, same time each day, like clockwork. But Ruth and the kids are just not visible. Maybe they're home buddies, Thomas says. For 2 weeks straight? Nora says. The kids haven't been in the yard once. Thomas doesn't have a good answer for that. The next day he's mowing the lawn, and he glances at the upstairs window of 119. There's a girl standing at the window. She's just standing there, looking out. Very still. When Thomas raises his hand in a wave, she looks at him for a long moment, and then she steps back from the window and disappears behind the curtain. Something about the stillness of her. Something about the way she stepped back, not quickly, not startled, but deliberate, like she was following a procedure. He finishes mowing the lawn and goes inside. Thomas and Nora have a neighbor on the other side named Pam, a woman in her 60s who has lived on the block for 30 years and knows everything about everyone. Not in a gossipy way, just in the way that some people absorb their surroundings. About 3 weeks after the family moves in, Pam mentions something to Nora over the fence. She says she saw Carl loading something into his trunk late at night, after midnight. A large box. Heavy, from the way he was moving. She watched through her bedroom window because the light of his car's interior had woken her up. Did he see you? Nora asks. That's what I can't stop thinking about, Pam says. Because right after he put the box in the trunk, he stopped. Just stood there in the driveway. And he turned and looked right at my window. Could he have seen you? You said the lights were off. They were off. I was in the dark. There's no way he could have known I was there. A pause. But he looked right at me. Thomas hears this story from Nora, and that night at dinner he's quieter than usual. Eli chatters about something that happened at school. Thomas smiles and nods and cuts his chicken. And through the kitchen window he can see the side of the house at 119. All the curtains closed. Every single one. Something shifts in Thomas after that night. He starts paying attention. Not obsessively. He's not the type for that. But he starts noticing things he'd normally let pass by. Carl always parks his car at a very specific angle in the driveway. Always the same angle, positioned so that the rearview mirror reflects the street. Every day, same position. The curtains at 119 are never fully open. They're always drawn to within an inch of being shut. Just a sliver of dark space between the fabric and the window frame. Carl never has visitors. No cars in the driveway that aren't his. No one coming and going. The mail at 119 piles up sometimes for 2 or 3 days. Then Carl comes out and collects it all at once. He doesn't look through it at the box like most people do. He gathers it all into his arms and takes it directly inside without pausing. The children never play outside. Eli mentions at dinner one evening that he's never seen the kids from next door at the bus stop. Maybe they go to a different school, Nora says. Or maybe they're homeschooled, Thomas says. But that night he thinks about the girl at the window. The way she stood. The way she moved back behind the curtain. The first time Thomas talks to Ruth is about 5 weeks after the family moves in. He comes home from school on a Wednesday afternoon to find her standing at the mailbox. She's collecting the mail, several days' worth by the look of it. She startles slightly when his car pulls in, even though he's driving at normal speed and it's the middle of the afternoon. He gets out and says hello. She says hello back. She's holding the mail against her chest with both arms, protective. He asks how they're all settling in. She says fine. He mentions that he's a teacher, and if the kids need anything related to school, recommendations for the district, anything like that, he's happy to help. She says they homeschool. He nods. That's great. Eli, that's our son, he's 5. If your kids ever want to play. We keep to ourselves mostly, she says quickly. Carl prefers it. Carl prefers it. The way she says it, flat, automatic, like a line she's rehearsed, makes the hair on Thomas's arms stand up. He says sure, of course, no pressure. She goes inside. He stands in his driveway for a moment before going into his own house. He finds Nora in the kitchen and tells her the conversation. She said Carl prefers it, he says. Nora looks at him. Like they're not allowed to have contact with the neighbors? She says. That's what it sounded like. They look at each other across the kitchen island. Thomas reaches out to a friend of his who teaches middle school. He asks, as casually as he can, if there are protocols in their district for identifying children who should be enrolled but aren't. His friend says yes, technically all school-age children are required to be registered somewhere. Even if homeschooled, there are reporting requirements. But in practice, the system has gaps. Kids fall through. Kids fall through. He calls the school district office that evening and explains that he has new neighbors with children of a parent's school age who have indicated they are homeschooling. He asks if there's a way to verify registration. The woman he speaks to takes a note and says someone will look into it. He doesn't hear back. What happens next is quiet and ordinary, and somehow worse than if it had been dramatic. A Friday evening, early May. Thomas is in his garage, organizing some tools. The garage door is open to the cool air. It's almost 7 o'clock, still light but dim. He hears a sound. It's small. It would have been nothing in any other context. A small hiccuping sound, like a child crying very quietly and trying not to make any noise. He steps to the open side of the garage and looks toward 119. There's a boy, the 12-year-old, he thinks, sitting on the narrow strip of grass between the two driveways. Just sitting on the ground, knees pulled up, head down. Shoulders shaking slightly. Thomas crouches down to the boy's level. Hey! Hey, are you okay? The boy looks up. His eyes are red. His face is carefully blank in the way that kids get when they've cried too much and learn to control their expressions. I'm fine, the boy says. Are you sure? You want to come inside and… I can't, the boy says very quickly. Then he seems to catch himself and adds, I mean, I have to go back in. What's your name? Thomas asks. A long pause. Long enough that Thomas thinks he's not going to answer. I can't tell you that, the boy says. And he gets up and goes back inside 119 and the door closes. Thomas stands in his driveway in the dimming evening light and stands very still. I can't tell you that. Thomas calls a non-emergency police line that night. He explains everything, the family's extreme isolation, the children never being seen outside, the conversation with the boy, the comment about the name. The dispatcher is patient and careful. She asks clarifying questions. She tells him an officer will do a wellness check. 2 days later, a Sunday, a single officer comes to 119. Thomas watches from his living room window. He's not proud of it, but he watches. Carl answers the door. He's calm and steady and invites the officer in. The officer is inside for maybe 12 minutes. When he comes back out, he has a brief follow-up conversation with Carl on the porch. They shake hands. The officer leaves. Thomas goes outside to intercept the officer before he gets to his car. Is everything okay in there? He asks. The officer, a young man, maybe mid-20s, looks at him with a kind of careful professionalism. Yes, sir. The family is fine. The children are healthy. Everything checks out. Did you speak to the children? Thomas asks. I spoke with the family, the officer says. Which is not quite an answer. Can I ask the children's names? Were they able to tell you? Sir, the officer says, a little more firmly now. The family is fine. There's nothing actionable here. He gets in his car and drives away. Thomas goes back inside. He sits at the kitchen table and stares at the wall. Nora comes in and asks what happened, and he tells her. She sits down across from him. Their son is upstairs, asleep. The house is quiet. Carl knew we called, Thomas says. He had to have known. We don't know that, Nora says. He looked directly at Pam's window. In the dark. When she was invisible. Thomas is speaking slowly, putting it together as he says it. He checked his mirrors every time he parked. He positioned himself to see the whole street. The kids can't give their names to a neighbor. The curtains are never open. He looks at Nora. He knows everything that's happening around him at all times. That's not paranoia. That's training. Nora is quiet for a moment. What kind of person lives like that? She says finally. Thomas doesn't answer, because he's thought about this and the answer scares him. He starts researching. He spends evenings going through public records databases, news archives, anything he can think of. He searches the name Carl paired with the street address of 119. Nothing comes up. He searches for missing children cases within a few states of their location, filtering by age range. There are more than he expected. He doesn't know what he's looking for. He searches for families living off the grid, isolated, controlling. He finds forums. He finds articles. He finds accounts from survivors of what's sometimes called high-control families or domestic captivity situations. He reads them until 2 in the morning, feeling increasingly sick, feeling like the world is bigger and darker than he normally allows himself to see. He goes to bed and stares at the ceiling. He texts his sister, who is a social worker in another city, and asks her to call him when she gets a chance. She calls the next morning. He tells her everything without telling her the address or names. She is quiet on the other end for a moment, and then says, "Tom. The child who wouldn't tell you his name. Yeah. That's not just shyness. Kids don't forget their names." She pauses. "That's a child who has been told, repeatedly, and probably with consequences, not to have contact with outsiders. Not to share identifying information." Thomas closes his eyes. "What do I do?" he says. "You call Child Protective Services directly. Not the police. CPS. You give them everything. Every detail. And you follow up. You don't stop following up." He calls CPS the next day. He speaks to a caseworker named Diane. She listens carefully and asks the same clarifying questions the police dispatcher did, but with more specificity. She asks about the physical condition of the children when he saw them. She asks about the structure of the neighborhood and the property. She says an investigation will be opened. 1 week later, 2 CPS workers and 2 police officers go to 119. Thomas is at work. Nora calls him at noon. "They took the children," she says. He sits down at his desk. "Are they?" "They're okay," Nora says. "I think they're okay. Pam talked to one of the officers. She said the kids are okay, but they're going to be evaluated." "And Carl?" A pause. "Carl and Ruth are being questioned. There are a lot of officers there now, Tom. More than just the 2. I'm watching from the window." Thomas came home from work that afternoon to find the activity winding down. The children were already gone, taken to a facility for assessment. A detective came and knocked on Thomas and Nora's door that evening. He explained that they couldn't share the details of an active investigation. He thanked Thomas for his calls and said his concern had been important. "Can you tell me if the children were being harmed?" Thomas asked. The detective looked at him. "The children are safe now," he said. "That's what matters." "Were those even their kids?" Thomas asked. The detective's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. "We're looking into that," he said carefully. Thomas didn't ask any more questions. Carl and Ruth were gone within 48 hours. The house at 119 was sealed by investigators for several days. Neighbors on Birchwood Lane talked to each other in hushed tones over fences and in driveways. The house sat empty again. After about 3 weeks, a for sale sign appeared. Months later, Thomas read a brief news item, not specifically naming his street or his neighborhood, but describing circumstances that fit closely enough, about a case involving 2 minors who had been located and returned to their biological families after an extended period of unlawful custody. 2 different families. 2 different cases of origin. He read the article twice. Then he closed his laptop. He thought about the girl at the window, standing perfectly still, looking out at a world she was kept from, taking one careful step back behind the curtain. He thought about the boy in the driveway, saying, "I can't tell you that." Not "I don't know." Not "why." Not any of the things a regular kid would say. "I can't." Because someone had made sure he knew there would be consequences if he did. Thomas still lives on Birchwood Lane. Eli is older now. He plays in the yard in the evenings. Thomas watches him from the porch. And every once in a while, when another family moves in nearby and things seem normal and quiet and ordinary, Thomas feels that familiar whisper of unease. Because he knows now what normal and quiet can hide. He knows that sometimes the most dangerous thing about your neighbor is how carefully they make sure you have no reason to look closely. He looks anyway. He always looks now. The last story comes from a woman named Priya. She's in her early 30s. She and her husband Dev had bought their first house a year and a half ago, a modest 3-bedroom in a friendly, tree-lined neighborhood, the kind of place with block parties and neighbors who bring you pie when you move in. They were genuinely excited when they moved there. It felt like the right place. Their house sat in the middle of a short cul-de-sac. There were 7 houses on their little loop of a street, including theirs. Most of the neighbors they knew by name within the first month, families mostly. A retired schoolteacher named Harold on their left. A couple with a toddler across the street. A man who worked nights and was rarely seen. And then there was Diane. Diane lived directly across the cul-de-sac, in the house with the blue shutters and the immaculate garden. She was in her late 60s. Small woman. White hair, always tidy. Very proper manner. She'd been on the street longer than almost anyone, over 20 years. She came to their door the day after they moved in with a pound cake wrapped in cellophane and a warm, gracious smile. "You're going to love it here," she told Priya. "This is a wonderful little street. Everyone looks out for each other." Priya thanked her and meant it. She thought Diane was lovely. For the first few months, Diane was exactly what she seemed to be. A friendly, slightly old-fashioned neighbor. She waved when she saw you. She remembered details, asked about things you'd mentioned in passing, the way a genuinely attentive person does. She brought over baked goods a few more times. She knew the history of every house on the cul-de-sac and would share little anecdotes freely. She was, by any measure, a good neighbor. Priya and Dev would see her in the mornings sometimes, tending her garden. She was out there most mornings, early, sometimes before 7, weeding or pruning or watering. Always with the same focused, deliberate energy. The garden was genuinely beautiful. Roses along the fence. Neat beds of seasonal color. Priya complimented it every chance she got. "I like to keep an eye on things," Diane would say, with her neat little smile. The first odd thing Priya noticed was around 6 months in. She came home from work on a Thursday afternoon, earlier than usual, because she had a doctor's appointment that had finished quickly. Dev wasn't home yet. She pulled into the driveway and was getting her bag out of the car when she happened to look across the cul-de-sac. Diane was in her front garden, kneeling between 2 rose bushes, and she was looking at Priya's house. Not at Priya. At the house. Specifically at the front windows and the door. She was watching with a concentrated, focused expression, the look of someone taking inventory. When she noticed Priya looking at her, her expression changed immediately. She smiled and waved. "Home early," she called. "Yeah, appointment got done quick," Priya called back, and went inside. She stood in her front hallway for a moment, purse still over her shoulder. "She knew I was home early." Of course she knew, she'd seen her pull in. That wasn't the odd part. The odd part was the expression before the wave. The attentiveness. The way she'd been watching the house before Priya arrived, not after. Like she'd been waiting to see when someone would show up. A few weeks later, Priya mentions this to Dev. He listens. He says it might have been nothing. Diane's probably just a woman who pays a lot of attention to her surroundings out of habit. Older people who've lived alone a long time sometimes get like that. Priya agrees. She lets it go. But then something shifts. She starts coming home early occasionally. She works flex hours. And she starts noticing that Diane is almost always out front when she arrives. Not always doing something obvious. Sometimes just standing at the garden. Sometimes walking to her mailbox with very slow, deliberate steps. Sometimes sitting on her porch. Always facing the street. And Priya begins to realize that Diane always knows, within a minute or two, when anyone on the cul-de-sac comes or goes. She references comings and goings in conversation with an accuracy that should require constant observation. "I saw you and Dev come home quite late on Saturday," she'll say. "Big night out?" Big smile. "I noticed you had a visitor Thursday, drove a white Hyundai? That a work colleague of yours? I thought you were going out of town last week, saw your car sit all of Monday." Each one individually would be nothing. But together they build into a picture. Diane is watching the cul-de-sac constantly. Not occasionally. Not sometimes. Constantly. The thing that escalates it from odd to genuinely troubling happens on a Sunday morning in November. Priya and Dev have had a difficult few weeks. Some tension between them, nothing serious, just the low-grade stress of busy lives and some miscommunication that's been piling up. They have an argument Saturday night. Nothing dramatic. Raised voices for maybe 10 minutes. Then quiet. They resolve it, more or less, and go to sleep. Sunday morning, Priya is in the garden pulling dead plants from the beds before the frost hits fully. She sees Diane across the cul-de-sac, out front as usual. Diane comes over. She asks how Priya is. Priya says fine. Diane says, "Are things okay? Between you and Dev? I hope I'm not being too forward, but I thought I heard, well. I just want to make sure everyone on the street is all right." Priya stares at her. "We're fine," she says carefully. "Thank you for asking." Diane nods with a look that manages to be concerned and satisfied at the same time. She goes back to her own garden. Priya kneels in the dirt with her hands among the dead flower stems and thinks about this for a long time. The argument had been inside. Windows closed. No unusual volume. On a Saturday evening in November when no one is outside. For Diane to have heard it, to have heard enough to assess that things weren't okay between Priya and Dev, she would have had to have been very close to the house. Or listening very carefully. From across the cul-de-sac. That week, Priya starts doing something she's slightly embarrassed about. She sets up a small camera on her front porch. She tells herself it's for security, for the package deliveries they've been getting more frequently. It's pointed at the front path and incidentally catches a portion of the cul-de-sac. She doesn't mention it to Dev immediately. She checks the footage after a few days. In 72 hours of footage, Diane appears on her front porch or in her front garden at 47 separate time points. She is outside, in some capacity facing the cul-de-sac, for an average of 6 hours per day. 6 hours. Priya watches the footage with a feeling in her chest that she can't quite name. Not just unease. Something colder. Something that has to do with the realization that this has been happening every single day for a year and a half without her knowing. Diane isn't just aware of their schedules. Diane has their schedules memorized. She starts comparing Diane's presence on the footage against their own activity. Coming home times. When lights go on and off. When the car moves. When there's activity in the front rooms. The correlation is nearly perfect. Every time Priya or Dev changes their routine, comes home later, leaves earlier, has a visitor, Diane is outside within minutes. As if she's checking. Verifying. It reminds Priya, horribly, of a security guard doing rounds. She finally sits down with Dev and shows him the footage. He watches it quietly. Then he watches it again. Then he sits back and runs his hands over his face. "This is every day?" he says. "As far as I can tell," Priya says. "Going back to whenever we moved in." They sit together in the quiet house. Outside, through the front window, the cul-de-sac is still and dark. Diane's house is visible across the way, the blue shutters closed for the night. "What does she want?" Deb says finally. "I don't know," Priya says. And that's the part that bothers her most. Not the surveillance, as horrifying as that is. The total absence of any clear motive. She starts asking around carefully. She talks to Harold, the retired schoolteacher on their left. She steers the conversation naturally toward Diane and the history of the street. Harold is happy to talk. He's lived there 12 years, he says. Diane was already there when he arrived. Wonderful woman, he says. Very community-minded. A pause. Very aware of what's happening on the street. Has she always been like that? With the watching? Harold looks at her with an expression that suggests he understands exactly what she means and is choosing his words. Diane has a system, he says finally. She always has. When I first moved here, I found it reassuring. I've lived here long enough that I don't really notice it anymore. What kind of system? Harold is quiet for a moment. She told me once that she keeps a log of activity on the street. Who comes and goes? Visitors. Deliveries. She said it was for the neighborhood association, safety records, she called it. That if anything ever happened, she'd be able to provide accurate information. A log. Priya goes home and thinks about this. A written record of everyone's activity. For over 20 years. She doesn't confront Diane directly. She discusses it with Dev for a week and they decide the most measured approach is to talk to her neighbor to neighbor. Calm. Non-accusatory. They go together on a Saturday afternoon. Diane answers the door in her usual neat way. Surprised but welcoming. She invites them in. Priya has prepared what she wants to say. She says she wants to ask about the log that Harold mentioned. She says she wants to understand what information Diane has been keeping about them and why. Diane listens to all of this with a very composed face. Then she says, "Would you like to see it?" Priya hadn't expected that. Diane goes to a large cabinet in her dining room and removes 3 thick binders. She sets them on the table. The spines are labeled by year. 22 years of records. She opens the current year and shows them. Column headings: date, time, address, vehicle, activity, visitor Y/N, notes. Row after row after row. In Diane's precise, old-fashioned handwriting. Every entry from their street. She flips to a section that corresponds to Priya and Dev's address. There they are. 1.5 years of their lives on Birchwood Court. Every time they came home. Every time they had a guest. Every argument significant enough to note. Dev's work travel. Priya's flex days. The white Hyundai that had been Priya's college friend visiting once in March. All of it. Priya stares at the pages. Why? She says quietly. Why would you do this? Diane is quiet for a moment. She looks at the binder, not at Priya. 23 years ago, she says, my husband was attacked 3 houses down from here. In the street. In the middle of the afternoon. Broad daylight. Her voice is steady, but something underneath it isn't. Nobody saw anything. Nobody could say who had been on the street that day. No one remembered. They never found who did it. A pause. He survived. But barely. And I thought if someone had just been paying attention. If someone had just kept a record. She closes the binder. I kept one. For everyone. The silence in Diane's dining room lasts a long time. Priya looks at the 3 thick binders on the table. 22 years of this woman's neighbors' lives, documented in a cabinet across the cul-de-sac. The rows and rows of her careful handwriting. The dates and times and visitor notations. She thinks about how every wave, every comment, every knowing reference to their comings and goings was Diane simply reporting back. Showing the depth of the record. Making sure they knew, in some way, that they were seen. She thinks about being seen. She thinks about the difference between being looked after and being observed. She doesn't know where one ends and the other begins. She thinks about the husband, attacked in the street, in broad daylight. The thing that Diane had built all of this to prevent from happening to someone else. She doesn't know what to do with any of it. Priya and Dev don't call the police. There's no law against keeping records of public activity, things visible from a public street. The legal advice Priya looks into confirms this. What Diane is doing is unsettling, invasive in spirit if not in law, but not technically criminal. They ask her to stop keeping records of their homes specifically. Diane agrees. She says she understands. Priya believes she means it. But here's what Priya told me when she shared this story. Here's the thing she said she couldn't get out of her head. The night she and Dev had the argument. The raised voices inside the closed house on a November evening in the quiet cul-de-sac. Diane had heard it. From across the street. Which means Diane hadn't just been watching from her porch or her garden. Diane had been close to their house. Close enough to hear through the walls. Close enough to hear what was happening inside. Which means Diane had crossed the street. And stood outside their house. Listening. In the dark. Without either of them knowing. Priya says that sometimes, late at night, she goes to the front window and looks out at the cul-de-sac. It's always quiet. Always still. Diane's house is dark, the blue shutters closed. But she always wonders, if somewhere behind those closed shutters, in the neat dining room with the cabinet against the wall, the records are still being kept. And she wonders how long she and Dev have been on pages that weren't meant for them to see. She wonders if they still are. Three stories. 3 neighbors. 3 reminders that the people closest to us, the ones separated from us by nothing more than a wall, or a driveway, or a quiet stretch of street, are sometimes not who we think they are. Gerald, who turned a shared wall into a window. Carl, who turned a normal house into a prison with curtains. Diane, who turned a neighborhood into a file. None of them seemed dangerous at first glance. None of them set off immediate alarms. They looked ordinary. They said the right things. They smiled when they were supposed to smile. And that's the part that's hardest to sit with. Because if it can happen to Cassie, and Thomas, and Priya, people just living their ordinary lives in ordinary places, then the question kind of hangs in the air, doesn't it? What do you actually know about the person next door? When was the last time you really looked? Stay safe out there, everyone. Lock your doors. Trust your instincts. And if something feels wrong, even if you can't explain why, pay attention to that feeling. It might be the most important thing you do. Which story scared you the most? Comment below and subscribe for more true horror stories. If you want to share your story with us, send us at belladarktales@gmail.com.